Hello everyone, long time no see. It's been a minute. I have been rather busy just with life, with studies, and with finding orientation as to my direction going forward. So, there's a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go straight into it. But before I do, I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Anthony Vison. I go by Stoic Viper on twitch.tv as well as on Twitter. I am a writer for the Jerusalem Post, Area Magazine, and the region. My area of focus is the Middle East and North Africa region, with a specific focus on Kurdish issues. I also focus on foreign policy more generally speaking, with an attention to Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent, Israel. So today I thought I'd cover a couple events that have been going on throughout the globe, but notably I want to cover 3 or 4 events. The first would be covering the Hasakah Prison riots that had just ended a couple hours ago in the northeast of Syria. I want to cover the Ukraine-Russia crisis that is emerging with the potential of Russia seeking to invade further into Ukraine. The third thing I want to cover is the JCPOA talks and Iran's nuclear ambitions. So these are the things I want to cover today. I'll add a couple other things later on, but for the moment I just want to cover those things at the moment. So let's get right into it. Now, in the northeast of Syria, there has been a long 7 days of fighting between the Syrian Democratic Forces, a multi-ethnic coalition of militias formed in the wake of 2015 with the war against Daesh starting. These fighters, united in their resolve to defeat Daesh's caliphate, or so-called caliphate, have been fighting since 2015 to get rid of Daesh, but they also form the backbone of the self-administration of northeast Syria's main forces. Now, the AANES, as it's put into this lovely acronym, is the self-administrative body of the northeast of Syria. It's at the moment led by a couple different parties, notably the PYD, or the Democratic Union Party, who has had administrative duties of this little region for the last nearly 10 years, since the war started in 2011. Now, for a little bit of context before I go into the Hasakah riot itself, since about 2014, ever since the Battle of Kobani in 2014, the Syrian Democratic Forces, with its main appendage being the People's Protection Units, or YPG, has been fighting the Islamic State, otherwise known as Daesh, in the northeast of Syria. They had successfully pushed Daesh all the way down to Baghouz in the southeast in 2019, where they completely defeated the self-declared caliphate that Daesh had declared back in 2015 under Abu Baghdadi. Now, I want to mention that because it provides important context for the war against ISIS. The Syrian Democratic Forces have been a significantly helpful local partner force in this wider war to eliminate Daesh. However, the international community has been rather reluctant to repatriate over 10,000 prisoners that the Syrian Democratic Forces now de facto have to play warden for. These states, instead of repatriating these various different prisoners and their families, have instead decided to relinquish the citizenship of these fighters, thus forcing the burden for taking care of these fighters in the hands of the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, the problem with that being that the SDF is already overburdened in its war against Daesh, not just in its war against Daesh, but also against Turkish-backed forces of the Syrian National Army, who provide the bulk main opposition against the Assad regime, but who are also made up of jihadists and Islamists alike. So these are kind of the de facto realities when it comes to Syria. These forces have been used against the Syrian Democratic Forces because the SDF, you could say, is viewed as an extension of a terrorist organization that Turkey perceives as being its arch nemesis, that being the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. Turkey views the SDF as an extension of this terrorist organization, and since then it's been engaged in a long conflict with the SDF ever since 2016 roughly, with Operation Euphrates Shield, which pushed into Jarablus' pocket to try to divide the YPG from putting together its cantons, to its intervention into Afrin to undermine the Afrin Civil Council, which is an extension of the AANES, with Operation Olive Branch. And finally, most recently, in late 2019, we could say that in October 2019, Turkey invaded Sarakania and Gedespi, sort of like the spiritual hubs of the Rojava Revolution, in an attempt to undermine the Syrian Democratic Forces as well as Rojava in general. So this is the state of affairs when it comes to the northeast of Syria. Turkey has also imposed an embargo on the AANES. So in combination with a Daesh threat, as well as a wider Turkish threat, and a decline in economic situation, including poor food shortages in the northeast, the Syrian Democratic Forces and the self-administration of northeast Syria generally are not really in a good position at the moment. They are pulled in various different directions, which makes it quite difficult for them to adequately maintain their stature. Now, obviously, this is the kind of the context that's necessary for what has happened in Hasakah. Now, for all of those of you who don't know where Hasakah is, I shall show you. Hold on a second. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, boom, done. Okay, the Hasakah region is here in the northeast of Syria. It is jointly controlled by the Assad regime and Rojava forces. But there are also nearby prisons, most notably for this case, a prison in Guerrien, otherwise known as El Sinai prison. And that's going to be the focal point for today. So let me get back to the main webcam. So, what's been going on in Hasakah? Since January 20th, actually early January 20th, Daesh sleeper cells rammed a suicide vehicle into the prison walls and prison cells, opening up a corridor for Daesh inmates to essentially consolidate and riot. Now, prior to this, there had been weapons smuggled in, and prior to this, there had been already activity by Daesh against the Syrian Democratic Forces, but it had always been quelled from time to time, because there are about three main focal points when it comes to Daesh resurgence activity. The first is in the Raqqa province, which is in the south of the northeast. It used to be one of the main capitals for Daesh's so-called caliphate. It was liberated in 2017, mid-2017, by the Syrian Democratic Forces. However, it's since then been dealing with sleeper cells, which are usually individuals who are operating clandestinely to try and undermine the Syrian Democratic Forces as well as the people of Raqqa. Another area of focal point was the Deir Zor in the southeast. That was where the Syrian Democratic Forces liberated a city called Baghouz in early 2019. There's been Daesh sleeper cells that have caused quite a problem, which has led to a couple of raids by the Syrian Democratic Forces, especially their Azayesh, which are like the internal security forces for Rojava forces that deal with technically counter-terrorism and counterinsurgencies. And the final part has been in the Hasakah area, where in Hasakah, as I mentioned before, there's the Al Sinai prison, but also near to those areas as well are a couple of different camps, most notably the Al Hol camp. Now the Al Hol camp is home to over 3,000, actually over 5,000 Daesh residents, including Daesh family members and their children. The Al Sinai prison has about roughly 3,000 inmates in it, mostly former Daesh fighters, but also around 700 minors are also in that area. These minors are fanatical, and they were essentially indoctrinated into Daesh, but they consist of some of the bulk of the people that were in the Al Sinai prison. So when this vehicle rammed its car into the walls of the Al Sinai prison, it caused a riot, you could say, where Daesh inmates take an opportunity of the moment, seized weaponry, and decided to take over 20 SDF, or Syrian Democratic Forces, hostage who were guarding the prison. Not only that, but also roughly under 700 minors were also taken hostage as well. Daesh had threatened to behead, which did some of them, but also was in fierce fighting with the Syrian Democratic Forces, which pushed roughly about 10,000 of its forces to combat these Daesh sleeper cells and these Daesh prisoners. So for the last about week, there has been clashes between the two forces, with the Syrian Democratic Forces only recently having liberated the last residuals of the prison, because the prison had about 20% of it had been captured actually by the Daesh. This has been a major attack, and it's been one of the biggest as of late against the Syrian Democratic Forces, and also represents essentially Daesh's resurgence in the northeast, something that has been a major concern not only for the Syrian Democratic Forces but also for the international community. So I shall show you some videos from that now. Okay. These are all SFW. I made sure of that, that's for sure, certain. Okay. So this is from Mohammed Hassan.
زندنا زندنا الصناعة
This is about
وقف شتى خورا
roughly a
دستي
couple hundred
لازم
Daesh
سوريا
prisoners
ديمقراطيك كرن
who
هاكون
were
يكو
taken hostage.
دخواستن قتل عامكي برمغزن در حقي قالين حريمي دبيك بينن
So this was filmed, I believe,
شخوابك شربانين
Mohammed Hassan, who's a local.
قاسة ديجي ديار كركو قف شش روش نابرا
quality of the
لازم
video,
سوريا ديمقراطيك وبات شطانا شرين كرد
the
جوار
long line
رودابون
of prisoners that had
وهاكون دبينن قالك جوانا جخوا برين دارن
Syrian Democratic Forces. Awesome. Another video that I would like to share. Here's an example, by the way. This is an image of a YPG fighter who had been actually held hostage for about roughly 5 days by the Islamic State. He was deprived of food, and this is him after his liberation, essentially. Yeah. Here are some of the Emirates and other vehicles from the British and US Special Forces who came to help liberate the area. So there are these vehicles. They help with actually besieging the prison and actually liberating it. These are some Syrian Democratic Forces fighters, as well as UK Special Forces and US Special Forces at the moment heading towards the prison, which is in the El Waban area and the Hasakah. Now roughly a couple dozen families were, actually a few dozen families were actually asked to evacuate the area around. So yeah. Here is SDF going in. Well, here are Syrian Democratic Forces going in. These are the forces that went into the prison area. I don't know if I could share this. So I'll give you an example of some of the fighting as well, without it being too explicit. So this is some of the Syrian Democratic Forces taking the high ground in order to provide overwatch. These are the H-18 and the Y-18. The Y-18 are special forces of the They are responsible for special operations, especially when it comes to local counter-terrorists. They are like similar to the Daesh. The Daesh, as I mentioned before, the internal security forces for the Syrian Democratic Forces. The Daesh's main elite units are the HAT. The HAT are simply the equivalent of SWAT, essentially. So this is the prison complex of the Syrian prisoners. Now, Daesh, you got to understand that the reason why they're shooting, it may look like they're shooting into nothing, but Daesh actually have weaponry stuck out of some of the little windows and crevices of the complex, and they're actually firing back at the SDF. So this man has an RPG on his shoulder. Fire just gives you an example of the sieging of this prison complex. Okay, so this is a picture from Amaq. An Amaq news agency is actually one of Daesh's propaganda outlets. This comes from Dastan Yassim, and she works for the GIGA, which is a Deutschland think tank. So obviously it's blurred out, the Daesh flag and all that kind of stuff, but you can see clearly the hostages, which are notably SDF, probably SDF prison guards and that, being held hostage by Daesh fighters. And you can see one of these Daesh insurgents, you could say, brandishing what appears to be a machete of some kind or some long knife. One needs only not be too creative to come up with what's actually bound to happen after this picture is taken. So this just shows you an example. So the siege lasted roughly over 5 days. And it was broken by the Syrian Democratic Forces actually a couple hours ago. So I'll actually show you some of the footage from that. Unfortunately, there were a lot of martyrs, as you can see. So I showed you guys the pixelated video of the prisoners. I'll show you a much more clear photo. This is actually taken by, I think if I recall correctly, it was taken by the Washington Post. It was obtained by the Washington Post. I think it was taken by a local journalist. But yeah, you can see the prisoners exiting the complex and being rounded up by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Here is the Syrian Democratic Forces on the Iran, celebrating the victory they've just won against. Also taken by Mohammed Hassan. Here is a YPG fighter, which the YPG, for those who don't know, are the Women's Protection Units. They are an extension of the People's Protection Units, and they make up part of the Rojava Forces or the Syrian Democratic Forces. You can see it here. YPG fighter looks over all the Daesh prisoners. It's quite ironic actually to see a woman fighter look over a defeated, theocratic, and most likely misogynistic force of people who have no other desire but to see her subjugated. So it's a bit of irony to see them being essentially watched over by a female fighter. Okay, this is another video. This is actually of SDF fighter who had been liberated by the rest of the Syrian Democratic Forces. He was one of the hostages, and this is him being reunited with his loved ones. Keep in mind that these people had to endure about 5 days without food and water. Almost 5 days. I love this picture so much. This is 3 YPG fighters overlooking roughly over 100 or so prisoners as they re-enter the complex after being captured. This is Shervano, YPG Denese Kobani Sarkiften Oppressiono Li Berbaneri Chetian Daesh Dinerixine. So roughly the warriors of the YPG, who I think this is her name, Denise Kobani, claimed victory over the oppressors of Daesh. Okay, so I think that's what it translates to. Yeah, okay, yeah. Roughly the same translation. So yeah. Right. Okay. It's quite good that the Syrian Democratic Forces recaptured the prison. But I think there's something important to be noted here, and I think there's something that really the international community needs to consider quite closely. There still remain over 3,000 Daesh fighters that were currently occupying El Sinai prison, okay, before the siege began. These fighters have been there roughly since prior to 2017. It was actually 2017, 2018. These fighters have been stuck there. And may I just remind you that a lot of these fighters actually come from abroad. They come from different countries. They come from Turkey. They come from Australia, the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, whatever you name it, they're from there. Because over 40% of the fighters that Daesh had came from abroad. Yet the international community, instead of taking responsibility for these fighters who still have the citizenship of those nations, instead we have plenty of different states such as Australia and the United Kingdom who have essentially said that, okay, we're not going to repatriate our fighters, so we're not going to take responsibility for our human garbage. But 2, we're going to relinquish our responsibility by essentially getting rid of their passports and essentially getting rid of their citizenship. So in other words, they're now stateless people. And 3, we're not even going to do our mere basic minimum of actually helping our fellow local partner forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, with some support to help them deal with Daesh. Instead, we're going to just let them be effectively the wardens over our human garbage. What I find it actually kind of morally reprehensible that the international community has failed to take responsibility and repatriate their prisoners from the Syrian Democratic Forces and, of course, the Self-Administration Northeast Syria, AANES, have actually failed to take responsibility for these fighters and instead given them to already a people that is stretched thinly between having to deal with the Daesh insurgency, or resurgence I should say, as well as Turkey and an embargo as well to boot. So I think it's quite irresponsible that countries like Australia and the United Kingdom do not repatriate their prisoners. Now, one could argue, well, Anthony, these fighters went off to go fight and essentially murder local indigenous people, such as the Yazidis. Why should we repatriate them? You know, they relinquished their citizenship already by going off to fight. Well, yeah, that's all fair and dandy, but the problem is that it actually, you're giving away your responsibility, fundamentally, as a state, to being responsible legally for these people, because they're technically still citizens. Instead of trying to create maybe an international tribunal to try these individuals for war crimes and crimes against humanity and such, there's not even an active effort to do that. So effectively, what the international community has been doing with this has been essentially telling the Syrian Democratic Forces that, one, we don't really care about you, and two, we rather let you take care of our garbage, which I think is self-evident as to why that's a bad thing. I personally believe that there should be some form of an international tribunal, not only to address the war crimes and crimes against humanity of these fighters, and also to record their injustices for future prosperity, but also to kind of have some legal consequence for these fighters. I also think that these fighters should also be repatriated if there's not going to be an international tribunal. They need to be repatriated by their home countries. Now, I know that countries like Sweden and other countries like the United States have repatriated their fighters so they can try them on their own soil, or put them in Guantanamo Bay, or whatever you want to call it. But that's not good enough. There are still over 3,000 fighters that are stuck in the Northeast. As you've seen, this Hasakah prison riot, it represents a microcosm of a larger problem. Daesh is resurging, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, along with the self-administration in northeast Syria, is struggling to cope with the burden of that. And that's something that the international community can alleviate. Hence is why I would push for greater international cooperation and greater international responsibility for these fighters, so that we do not see another El Sinai prison riot, or we do not see another one of these events happening again. But for the moment, putting all that aside, I am happy that the Syrian Democratic Forces have regained control over the situation. I am very happy for that. I want to share some of the sentiments by a friend of mine by the name of Dustin Yassim. She is part of a think tank known as the GIGA. It's a German think tank. She writes over here on Twitter, she says, "If you lead an armed fight, take children as hostages, behead guards, and blow yourself up, you don't get to be civilians for a day," talking to so-called human rights organizations. If they had no interest for how these prisoners will be taken care of, they don't need to misinform them now. There is not a single official UN humanitarian corridor to Rojava. That's another name for the self-administration northeast Syria, the territories in the northeast. Basically, it's this yellow area that's considered Rojava. There's not a single official UN humanitarian corridor to Rojava since the last 10 years. There's no official plan for any legal international tribunal against these terrorists. There are thousands of violent ISIS fighters and their families that no one wants to bring home. And these people are telling me that now that Daesh is actively attacking people and causing more displacement, these organizations are out there having interviews with Daesh, personnel painting them to be civilians. What's going on right now is incredible. And she actually was referring to, I'll show you guys the tweets that she's actually referring to. Hold on a second. Oh god, why am I getting so much buzzes? Sorry. She's referring to this thread. This is from the Associate Director and Counterterrorism Lead at Human Rights Watch, Crisis and Conflict Division, and ex-foreign correspondent, Letta Taylor. Her thread is this, and I'll also respond to it. Updates on Syrian prison crisis in northeast Syria. I've made contact with a Canadian man, an American man, and an Australian boy inside the prison. Mind you that these are all Daesh individuals, by the way. They sound desperate. They say they've had no food or water for days. Describe dead and wounded everywhere. They say they fear they'll be shot if they try to come out. They are begging for food, water, medicine for the United Nations or other international organizations to negotiate their safe exit. Mind you, she's talking about Daesh prisoners here. People who literally beheaded, Yazidis who literally beheaded and killed innocent civilians across the northeast and in northern Iraq. Keep that in mind. We're starving, we're thirsty. There's no food, there's no water, there's no medical supplies at all. We're scared. We just need someone to help us get out of here, to help us get to safety, says a prisoner who identified himself as an 18-year-old US citizen. We need some NGOs to help us to get some people to safety, or to help them with food or water, the 18-year-old from the US said. He sounded very weak. One prisoner, the Australian 17-year-old, whose audio clips I heard earlier describing how he was wounded in the head earlier on amid US-led coalition SDF efforts to recapture the prison, he said he saw his friends, boys, shot dead in front of him. May I just remind people again, this is a Daesh prisoner, okay? This is a person who willingly went off to join Daesh in his genocidal campaign against indigenous folk, and in the subjugation of women, the enslavement of women, the decapitation and beheading of multiple individuals across multiple ethnicities. Okay, keep that in mind. I was just sitting in my cell and an explosion happened, the Australian boy said. I ran outside because they were shooting at our building, cell block. I ran out with my friends, and on the way my friends got killed in front of me. A 14-year-old, a 15-year-old. I kept running, the 17-year-old said. That's when he said he was hit in an Apache attack. I got injured in my head and my hand. I lost a lot of blood. I don't know what to do. There's no doctors here. There's no one who can help me. I'm very scared. I need help. Please. Okay, I think you get the picture. It goes on for a couple other tweets. Basically, what Letta Taylor is doing here by effect, and let me just put my screen to wide, is she's effectively trying to humanize Daesh prisoners. She's effectively trying to make it out as if these Daesh prisoners are desperate, and out of their desperation, somehow they had to riot and somehow had to fight the SDF, and they're in a bad situation overall. Okay, and she's essentially she says later on that these prisoners told me the children, like the tuberculosis patients, are now mixed in with the adults. We at Human Rights Watch urge all parties to adhere to their responsibilities to protect these prisoners, the children and adults too. So she has the audacity. She has the gall. May I just say, let me put it back to main screen. She has the gall to say this after these prisoners who, may I just say, I'll agree with her on one thing. The United States, as well as other countries, do need to repatriate more of their prisoners. But let's make no mistake here. These are Daesh prisoners over here. They are people who volunteered to go, whether they came from abroad or were locals themselves, who volunteered to take up arms with a genocidal organization, who indoctrinated children, who enslaved women, who murdered hundreds of people violently in propaganda videos that are available to this day on sites such as LiveLeak and other such websites. And yet the Human Rights Watch has the gall to say that, oh well, we urge all parties to adhere to their responsibilities to protect these prisoners, the children and adults too. Mind you, that Daesh had taken captive hundreds of minors who had 20 plus SDF forces that were actually together, okay, as hostages. It amazes me how tone deaf, let's put it that way, how tone deaf the Human Rights Watch people can be. Okay, and I don't usually say this because I do actually respect the organization, but when you have people like Letta Taylor and other such individuals try to humanize these Daesh prisoners in the middle, may I just say, of them literally trying to escape the prison and literally holding hostages as they do it, I find that very tone deaf. I find it, if anything, a bit insensitive, to put it frankly. So I think with that said, and with all things considered, I'm just looking to see if there's any more clips I can see. I will now... Actually, there's actually something I wanted to read. That's it. That's what I wanted to read. So I'm going to read an article by the Washington Post. And this is written by Lusa Lovelock. Okay? So this kind of like summates everything, pretty much. US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces announced defeat of Islamic State in prison standoff. Here's a picture of a YPG member of the Syrian Democratic Forces outside Gwarian prison in Hasakah. Okay? This is from Baghdad. This is from 3:17 a.m. Eastern Standard Time yesterday. So that's roughly the 26th of January. The US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces said Wednesday that it had regained control of a prison for Islamic State militants in a northeast city, ending a days-long standoff that drew US ground troops into the fray and exposed the jail's vulnerability to attack. The siege of Gwarian prison in Hasakah began last Thursday as Islamist militant fighters set off a car bomb that prompted some prisoners to riot and overpower their guards, believing that the attackers had come to free them, said officials from the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. On Wednesday afternoon, that battle appeared to be over, but no one seemed able to state definitively how many inmates had escaped or been killed. Among the inmates had been around 700 minors, some captured on the battlefield 3 years ago, others separated from their mothers in detention camps. In a photo from the prison yard provided by an SDF official, traces of battle were etched on the wall. So they're talking about this picture over here. One section was scorched, and other parts had jagged holes where explosives or shrapnel had struck them. Scores of prisoners stood in line, dressed in orange jumpsuits and thin grey sweaters. Almost 3 years after the largely Kurdish-led SDF captured the final slither of land that the Islamic State described as its caliphate, roughly 10,000 alleged members of the extremist group are packed into prison cells across northeast Syria, in legal limbo awaiting trial or repatriation to their home countries. About 3,000 of those were in the facility in Hasakah, officials said. A complete head count was not available Wednesday, but it appeared that dozens of inmates may have escaped and that scores have been killed. Entry and exit from the city have been prohibited while fighting continued. The battle took place in a near blackout of media, aside from official statements from the SDF, but video footage and phone calls from inside cells indicated that the damage and bloodshed could be extensive. SDF spokesman Fahad Shami said there was significant damage in the prison's north wing, where mines are held. I would say that it can't be a prison again, Shami said. There has been a big fight there. So here's a YPG fighter in front of a makeshift, I would say, troop transport / technical, I guess. The attack on the prison was the Islamic State's most serious strike in years. Negotiations had been underway for several days to end the standoff. Since yesterday morning, the number of prison staff liberated had risen to 23. The SDF said in a statement Wednesday before the final surrender. Video footage circulated by the SDF Press Center showed several prison staff as being supported on their way out, their arms slumped around the shoulders of SDF colleagues as they hobbled towards an ambulance, after days without food or water, They looked exhausted. The US-led coalition launched days of airstrikes in support of the ground troops, many within the perimeter of the prison itself. A coalition official said that the force also bombed alleged militants' industrial land around the facility, and that some strikes damaged the prison building. Coalition ground forces were also present, using armored vehicles to support the SDF as it fanned out around the prison to make the perimeter impermeable. Huddling in a nearby mosque this week, civilians described a panicked escape as fighting engulfed the area. "We didn't bring anything with us. We just wanted to get the kids out," said 36-year-old Nashmia al-Nadir. "It's been years since such an attack. We thought that ISIS must be far from where we live." The siege of Gwarian prison unfolded like a chronicle foretold. Senior Kurdish and US-led coalition officials have been warning for years that the prison was poorly defended and vulnerable to attack. Islamic State leaders have repeatedly urged their followers to break free fellow militants. "This isn't a surprise," said one senior Western official, speaking on the condition of anonymity because he was not authorized to talk to the media. Everyone knew this might happen, and I even as well. This was predictable. But the size of the attack from outside the prison walls caught the SDF by surprise, and suggested that the militants, thought to be largely defeated, may have rebuilt their fighting capabilities more than previously thought. For days they used snipers, grenades, and suicide belts to hold their ground as civilians streamed off surrounding neighborhoods amid the din of battle. This is a symptom of the strength that ISIS has been building for itself over the past year and a half, said Gregory Waters, a non-resident scholar of the Middle East Institute. Why did they have to use Gregory Waters of all people? Jesus Christ, whatever. Don't like Gregory Waters. In public statements, the SDF said the attack had been planned for up to 6 months. It was unclear how this was known or why the attack had not been thwarted. There are no indications that the Islamic State is strong enough to take territory, as it did in 2014 when it established a caliphate the size of Britain. But Syria's fractured politics and geography have helped some sleeper cells to regroup, experts say. When faced with pressure from the SDF and US-led coalition, some moved into territory held by forces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. You've got to remember that Hasakah, as I've shown you guys before, Hasakah is co-administered, rightly, I guess you could say, partially you should say, by the Assad forces in this area predominantly. There's also co-rule in Qamishli as well. So these are the main areas where the Assad regime still has a presence in the northeast of Syria. And when pressure increased there, they returned. Residents and officials say the fighters secured some freedom to operate by intimidating local communities. In recent months, the SDF says it has prevented a string of planned Islamic State attacks in northeast cities. This is why there's been so much counter-terrorism measures, essentially, including the one on the Hasakah prison. These should have been red flags, Waters said. The group's growth has been going on for long enough that they're confident enough in their ability to conduct more complex attacks. Questions about the prison's future are abound now. Although the facility has housed hundreds of foreigners, among them North Americans, Europeans, and Australians, their home governments have shown little sign they intend to repatriate the citizens for trial or rehabilitation. Shami, the SDF spokesman, said 400 prisoners have been moved to the other facilities, but did not identify those places, citing security concerns. Some of the minors have also been moved out in the general prison population, he said, an action that prompted rights monitors to express concerns for their safety, as we've seen. As the siege unfolded, okay, here we go. Letta Taylor, a counter-terrorism lead for Human Rights Watch, said she was speaking directly to inmates from Canada and Australia, which, may I just say, is a bit questionable how she actually got contact with those prisoners, and I don't know why she's actually perpetuating their narrative as if it's legitimate. Something that I find I find amazing that there's so many human rights organizations, such as HRW, who take concern over the quality of life of these prisoners, yet they have glossed over the fact that a lot of these prisoners committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically against Yazidis and the local population. Keep that in mind. So I'm a bit unsympathetic, to be honest. They sound desperate. They say they've had no food. Yet we get this. Okay, finally. Thousands more foreigners are spread across displacement camps that have become de facto detention facilities, with few signs that their governments will intervene anytime soon. A nearby British-funded detention facility built to ease overcrowding in the older building is nearing completion, officials said, but other facilities across the northeast are already in perilous state, with defences weak and overcrowding the norm. So, to recap, there had been a uprising in the Hasakah prison of Guaran prison and Al Sinai prison. They, mostly Daesh inmates, took hostage around about 20 or so SDF prison guards, with over 200 minors being also captured in the process as well and used as hostages. After 6 days of siege, the SDF, along with US and UK Special Forces, liberated the prison, and since then prisoners have been, we could say, emptied out the complex and put back into the complex. However, issues over the repatriation of these prisoners remain, and concerns over the ability of the Syrian Democratic Forces to maintain a strong grasp of these prisoners remains to be seen. So, at the 50-minute mark, I'm going to take a sip of my water. Okay. And I'm going to move on to Ukraine and Russia. Yep. By the way, had a long day. I tried to stream this earlier, but it failed, and that's why I'm making this video, by the way. Okay, righty-ho. Let's talk about the big issue that's been, you could say, very present in the news. And that is Russia and Ukraine. Now, to bring people up to speed, for those who don't know, I shall put a map up of where Ukraine is. Because unfortunately, you'll be surprised that people don't even know where it is. Okay. Let's go main. This is Ukraine. It's located in the east of Europe. It borders Belarus to the north of it, Poland to the west of it, Hungary to the southwest, Slovakia to the west, as well as it borders, technically also borders Russia to the east. So, for the longest time, and let me put it back to main webcam, Ukraine, since it was a Soviet republic under the Soviet Union back prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism in the east, Ukraine used to be under the sphere of influence of Russia. However, since after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainians finally had the ability to decide their own destiny, and they did that, and they formed the Ukrainian state. Part of this Ukrainian state had Russian population in it, most notably in the east as well as in Crimea. In 1994-1995, an agreement called, I should put it up right now, Budapest. Give me a moment. Text document. Here we go. Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Here we go. In 1990, 1994, December of 1994, an agreement between the United Kingdom, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine was signed, called the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. This memorandum stipulated that Ukraine would give up its nuclear missiles in exchange for assurances that Russia would never invade it or annex any territory. In fact, I shall read the following. Okay? So I shall read the following to you all. Okay. This is Article 1 of the Budapest Memorandum. The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine in accordance with the principles of the CSCA Final Act, to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. I think, let me put back to main webcam. Article 1 summarizes the gist of the Budapest Memorandum. Essentially, Ukraine, if you give up your nukes, we promise that Russia, as well as Russia itself, promises that it would not invade or violate the sovereignty of Ukraine. So keep that in mind. There was an international guarantee in 1994 between a couple of the global superpowers at the time, the Bill Clinton administration, as well as the Yeltsin administration in Russia, to ensure that Ukraine's border and sovereignty would be protected. Fast forward to the 2010s. A man by the name of Yanukovych, who is Vladimir Yanukovych, who's the president at this time of Ukraine, he has Russian sympathies. He's a corrupt individual, someone who at that time was suppressing the press, suppressing dissidents in Ukraine itself. He gets essentially overthrown. He gets forced to abdicate his position, or forced to resign, I should say, due to Euromaidan protesters. These people being protesters within Ukraine that seek to want to have Ukraine be part of the European Union. Okay, Vladimir Yanukovych, who was Russia's man in Ukraine, goes and flees to Russia, leaving Russia in this really precarious situation where it no longer has its man in Ukraine. Because prior to this, for a couple decades prior to this, Ukraine really didn't have any much interest in going westward. However, with the flurry of zeal with the Euromaidan protests, as well as corruption by Yanukovych, these things went to the surface. After the Euromaidan protests, there's a little bit of political instability. The Russian population within Crimea feels itself threatened by this political instability and seeks to hold a referendum on whether or not Crimea should remain as part of Ukraine. This referendum, which is put forward by the Crimean Parliament, essentially puts towards the people, should Crimea join with Russia, be annexed by Russia. Now, of course, the Ukrainian government that's trying to come after Yanukovych decides to petition the United States to essentially reaffirm the sovereignty of Ukraine. Okay? The United States attempts to do this through United Nations Security Council resolution, which is therefore vetoed by Russia, because Russia is one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And for those who don't know, the United Nations Security Council is one of the most important organs, I should say, of the United Nations. It's responsible for passing legally binding resolutions. It has 15 members on the council. 10 of them are rotational members that only last about 2 years, roughly, before another member comes in. Whereas there's 5 permanent members. There's the United States, the United Kingdom, there's Russia, and there's China. Russia, China, United States, United Kingdom, and France. These are the 5, I think so, 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. And they all have veto power, effectively. Okay? So, Russia vetoes, along with China, like they veto this resolution, which therefore allows the referendum to pass. So while the referendum is being voted on, Russia sends its little green men or special forces into Crimea to secure the vote of the Crimean parliament and secure the vote of the referendum. Something that it sort of like did by blocking out outside press to monitor the voting, as well as deploy its own Russian forces. So essentially the result was a foregone conclusion. It was evident that the referendum would be overwhelming support of Russia annexing Crimea, which it did. Now, Russia annexed Crimea both from a domestic standpoint to boost Putin's numbers up, because Putin at this time, Vladimir Putin, his poll numbers were kind of like decreasing, but after this it boosted up his poll numbers. But also to secure a Black Sea port, which is important access to the Black Sea, which Russia thought that Ukraine would be more susceptible to be coming into the ear of the West, which would make Russia vulnerable if the West actually had any control over the Black Sea, essentially. Russia annexes in midway 2014, Russia annexes Crimea. Okay, it violates the Article 1 of the Budapest Memorandum. Okay, that's the first thing. But not just that, it begins an insurgency in the Donbass region. And for those who don't know the Donbass region is, it is this region over here. Okay, it's the southeast of Ukraine. It consists of many different provinces, but the most notable are the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. Now, the Luhansk and Donetsk are areas where fighting starts to flourish because Russian-backed separatists form their own de facto republics, the Luhansk Republic and the Donetsk Republic respectively, in an effort to break away from Ukraine. Russia backs these insurgents to try to create political instability in Ukraine to prevent it from going to the West. Because at this time, Ukraine wanted to seek NATO membership, which it still does, and it sort of petitioned the United States and NATO to help speed up that process. Russia, seeing this as a vulnerability, essentially starts to back these insurgents in the southeast, leading to what we would call the war in Donbass. This war, which has been raging since 2014, sets the stage to what is happening today, essentially. During the course of this war, the Europeans, mostly the French and the Germans, opened up something called the Normandy format, where they essentially go to Russia with a proposal on how to solve the Ukrainian crisis. This proposal that they put forward, and that with Russia sort of like negotiates on, is called the Minsk Protocols. The Minsk Protocols essentially stipulated that, at least, or still negotiated, I should say, that these regions, these little republics, would be part of a united Ukraine, but would be given federal autonomy, something that Russia wanted to push. The Ukrainians reject this, obviously, because the Ukrainians at this point in time, they've called on volunteers to go and fight against these insurgents. And because Ukraine is reaffirming its sovereignty, Russia does not like that, so it continues to fund weaponry and armaments to these insurgents. Effectively, negotiations are stalemated for a number of years. In that time period, the United States as well as other countries put sanctions on Russia, but they also provide special operations support to the Ukrainian military. Some of the units that are part of the Ukrainian military include some distasteful entities like the Azov Battalion, which is made up of neo-Nazis. However, it must be important to note that the Azov Battalion consists of a fraction of the Ukrainian military's prowess. They are roughly about 5,000 troops, essentially. And that also that the United States Congress actually passed a series of bills a couple of years ago that prevented the funding of arms to, especially in 2018, to the Azov Battalion. So the United States technically does not fund the Azov Battalion anymore. It never really did to begin with, but it's like it doesn't explicitly fund it anymore. So this kind of like dispels this myth that the Azov Battalion is some form of like essentially armed by the West. So this brings us to 2018-2019, with the negotiation of the Minsk II protocols, which is what Russia wants, which is essentially that the Donetsk and Luhansk regions would become their own de facto autonomous regions within the united Ukraine, and that Ukraine would not actually acquiesce to NATO and join NATO. Something that's rejected by the Ukrainians. So fighting continues. However, since the start of 2021, the Russians have been building up forces around the Ukrainian border, specifically to the north in Belarus and to the east in areas around the eastern provinces of the Donbass, as well as in the south in Crimea. These forces have amassed over 100,000 at this point in time, with preparations to annex or invade further into Ukraine, which brings us to the current crisis. Now, let me give you guys a sort of like a map of where forces are. Boom. So here's where all these brigades are. They're in the east, they're in the south, and they're in the north. They're surrounding currently Ukraine. Now the speculation is that, I should put this away, that Ukraine would go and invade further past the Donbass region to try and cut off Ukraine, Western Ukraine from Eastern Ukraine by pushing all the way to the Dnieper River. And the Dnieper River, if you don't know, is this area here. It's this river that kind of runs de facto, that splits kind of Ukraine in half a bit. Kiev is based in the middle. That's the capital of Ukraine. It's based in the middle. And Zelensky has been trying for the last couple of months to gain international support through weapons and armaments. The United States, the United Kingdom, Spain, Poland, and Lithuania have all provided armaments to the Ukrainians, who actually fear an imposing operation by the Russians. Zelensky has been asking the United States to negotiate on his behalf. The United States have been trying to negotiate with the Putin regime, but the problem is that the Putin regime is quite stubborn. It doesn't want to acquiesce to any concessions. It does not want to do anything in regards to trying to de-escalate the conflict. If anything, Russia has been escalating tensions by demanding more and more from the Europeans. The Europeans have tried to provide a united front, but the problem is that Germany, who is very reliant on Russian natural gas with the Nord Stream, has refused to put the Nord Stream 2 on the line, or the negotiating table. So Olaf Scholz has kind of been very determined in trying to continue the legacy of Merkel, CDU government, to try and essentially be strong against Russia, but actually not do anything to represent that strength on a negotiating level. So they haven't put the Nord Stream 2 actually on the table. And if anything, the shutdown of over 50 nuclear reactors in Germany suggests that Germany is going to become more and more reliant on natural gas, which means, and if you look in conjunction with the sanctions relief that Germany has asked from the United States so it can exempt itself from sanctions when doing business with Russia, it would be clear as day that Germany really is not that interested in stopping Russia from invading Ukraine. Okay. So where does this put Russia and Ukraine at the moment? The United States has actually asked its diplomats and its citizens to actually evacuate from Ukraine, because it expects, at least according to intelligence, that Russia is going to invade Ukraine by the end of January sometime. Something that, unfortunately, I guess you could say, does not give Ukraine a lot of time. The West has been kind of quote-unquote united in their response, but in reality you have countries like Germany and France disagreeing as to the direction of Europe in terms of its negotiations with Russia. You have Russia who kind of doesn't believe the West anymore. And may I just say that's actually due to a number of factors. Notably that Russia does not believe in the sincerity of the West when it comes to its threats against Russia, because the West has threatened more sanctions against Russia. But evidently, that is not going to be enough to stop Russia. In fact, actually, and here's the crux of the issue. We have a megalomaniac dictator currently residing in Moscow. One who is paranoid, insecure, and hungry for more territory. Who has repeatedly gone and violated the sovereignty of many different countries, whether that be Moldova, whether that be Georgia, whether that be even Ukraine itself, who has backed many different autocratic regimes, whether that be the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, whether it be different regimes abroad, and that has repeatedly violated international law with regards to war crimes in its intensity when it comes to how it handles civilians, how it has a disregard for the international rule-based order. We have seen repeated acts of aggression by Russia for the last couple of years that are relentless. This goes all the way back to Chechnya and even before that, since the fall of the Soviet Union. We see a Russia that is incredibly desperate, a Russia that is incredibly aggressive to its neighbors, who keeps trying to parrot this idea that NATO is surrounding, which, by the way, and I'll play a video for you guys and gals and people who don't identify as either or both. Does not really matter to me. Okay. This is a video from the Ministry of Defense that shows actually where the borders between Russia and NATO are. Of those next to Alaska and Russia, you have it bordering near Norway, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And that's it. That's all the borders that Russia has with NATO. Yet NATO, as well as Russia's apologists, will keep saying that NATO surrounds Russia. It doesn't. You look, it's clear as day. Let's look at a map, wider map. You look at that. You see that. It only borders roughly a couple countries. Look at its 30,000 kilometer plus border it has. That it doesn't actually border technically NATO states. So this myth that Russia keeps perpetuating, that you'll keep hearing by people like Tucker Carlson, and what you'll hear from people basically who are quite sympathetic to Russia, is that, oh, Russia is being surrounded by NATO. Russia is being threatened by NATO. It's Russia's being the victim here. Which is quite actually annoying because it's not true at all. In fact, if anything, Russia has been a repeated aggressor. Ukraine had no interest whatsoever of joining NATO prior to 2014. The numbers show less than 40% of people cared to join NATO. That number is now 60%, with 80% of Ukrainians wanting to join the EU. All because of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and for its aggression in the Donbass. Russia repeatedly says that it wants NATO troops to withdraw from Romania and Bulgaria. It wants guarantees that eastern states like Finland as well as Sweden don't join NATO. It wants guarantees for the most ludicrous of things, all while it engages in acts of aggression, which may I say are war crimes. Okay, they engage in acts of aggression or wars of aggression are tantamount to violations of international law. What does that mean, you may ask? That means that Russia makes these ludicrous demands while spitting in the face of the international global order and expects the world to bow to it. What it makes it annoying is that people within places like New York City, or in nice privileged areas like myself, basically you could say in Queensland, where I am at the moment, would like to think that, and by the way, I'm just sort of like using an example, would like to think that, oh, no, it's NATO who are the aggressors. Oh, no, NATO was the one who promised Russia in the 90s they would not expand NATO's borders. Oh, no, Ukraine are equally bad because they have some Nazis in their ranks. Oh, no. Russia's not the aggressor, it's the victim of Western aggression. Yet, and I have to say this, yet, the evidence, the reality is that, one, there was no agreement made between Russia and NATO in the 90s that would specify that NATO's borders would remain at the 1991 borders. No agreement whatsoever. Okay? 2, countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as willingly joined NATO after the fall of the Soviet Union. Okay? 3, that Ukraine is a country with its problems, yes, may I just say, who's literally had a piece of its territory, Crimea, annexed by Russia, and is dealing with an insurgency in the southeast that has displaced tens of thousands of people. An insurgency backed by Russia, who has already been committing acts of aggression in places like Georgia, in South Ossetia, and Abkhazia, okay? Who has been bombing and killing civilians in Syria and places like Aleppo, Ghouta, Idlib, okay? Who has been backing dictators in places in Central America, who has been backing, with its Wagner forces, the most violent of actions against civilians. It's this entity which has violated the sovereignty of a small, medium-sized country known as Ukraine, who is now demanding that the West stop its aggression, and who is apologists who will say that Russia is not the aggressor. I ask people simply to look at the facts. What are the facts? I've told you them now. Russia is ruled by one man who keeps violating international law and keeps violating domestic law, who runs a mafia police state, okay, who has completely extended his term limits now indefinitely, who refuses to give up power, who treats his people like crap, and who has tanked the economy of the country while also militarizing at the same time, who has abused Ukrainians, who has abused Syrians, who have abused Chechens, who have abused so many different people across the globe, who is responsible for so much death and destruction, who has literally blood on his hands. They want to tell us that this is the man, this entity, this state led by Putin is somehow innocent. It's been the victim of Western aggression. I have to disagree profusely. It's not the victim of Western aggression. Russia is the aggressor here. Russia is the bully here. Russia is seeking to displace hundreds of thousands more if it invades the east of Ukraine further, which it will do. Who will use artillery, who will use air force, who will use special operations forces, who will use the strength of the Russian military to displace hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians from their homes, all in the effort to try keep a nation from going to NATO, and all in the effort to enable this vision of Nova Russia, to take the east of Ukraine for himself, in order to place pressure on the West, to try bully the West. Now people may ask, well, Anthony, we can't, what do you want us to do against Russia? We can't do anything against Russia. We don't want to start a world war, as is always the more famous and more, infamous, I should say, of excuses. Even though, may I just say, that the acquiescing and appeasement of the Putin regime only actually leads further and further into more likely conflict in the future. Because here's the scenario for you. If Russia invades the east of Ukraine, countries in the west of Europe will start to militarize further. They'll start putting money into armaments and to weaponry and into their defense forces. They'll start to militarize, in other words. This creates tension across Europe that how can you say risks the balance of stability and peace in Europe, which has the likelihood of leading more and more into conflict. So ironically, by seeking to do nothing against this bully, you in effect are actually laying the pavement down for the Russian tank that's marching its way towards global conflict. I'm not saying that the West should deploy hundreds of thousands of forces to Ukraine. I am just saying that when we make red lines in the sand, when we say to an autocrat, whether it be in Syria or in Russia, when we tell them that, hey, you stop here, or else we actually mean what we say. Because words alone are not enough to deter autocratic bullies like Russia. These bullies, unfortunately, only know strength, and they only know the strength of force that's behind words. That means that sometimes we need to be tough with countries like Russia. We need to tell them that, hey, if you invade this country over here, there will be consequences. There will be actions done against you. Not just sanctions, mind you, but actual potential military action, whether it be through bombings or whether it be through countermeasures. That's how we deal with preventing wider conflict, by nipping in the butt smaller conflicts. Okay? We actually become good partners and good allies to our friends who are in need against tyrants. That's what we do, that we must do. There's also been a precedent. Now people might say, well, Anthony, Ukraine's not part of NATO, so what can NATO do? Well, here's something I like to always bring up. 1997. Slobodan Milosevic is president of Serbia. In a small little region of Kosovo, in the southeast of Serbia, the Kosovars, fueled by sentiment of, a new state and fueled by their identity, are backed by the Albanians, decide to wage an insurgency against the Serbians. Slobodan Milosevic, in response, sends the Serbian military to crush the Kosovars, committing widespread ethnic cleansing and actually escalating more and more destruction of human and civilian lives. In 1999, after repeated violations of international law and after the repeated vetoing of United Nations Security Council resolutions to deal with the threat of violence against the Kosovars, by the way, these vetoes being done by China and Russia, NATO activates Article 4 and Article 5 and calls a joint meeting to actually do action against Slobodan Milosevic's forces. This results in 1999 an 11-week bombing campaign against Slobodan Milosevic's forces in Kosovo. This bombing campaign takes out the military capabilities of the Serbian military to enact violence towards civilians, such as the Kosovar people. It also pressures Slobodan Milosevic to get to the negotiating table and pressures him to sign a political settlement that ends the conflict there. It also allows for the transitionary government to be put in place in Kosovo, which allows it to eventually seek its independence later. But the point being is that NATO can act to defend a non-NATO state. Kosovo was not even a state then. It was part of a region that was not a NATO state. NATO can act to defend Kosovo. Stoltenberg, if he wanted to, can act against Russia if he wanted to protect Ukraine. the reason why we don't see that, I think, is because NATO has kind of lost its direction a bit. Ever since the fall of the communism in the Soviet Union, NATO kind of like became directionless for a bit. It was thought that humanitarian interventionism would be its new direction with interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo, but that slowly waned a bit. And since then, NATO has kind of been directionless a bit. Its main purpose of deterring Russia has kind of like been split amongst its members. Hungary is an autocratic state, headed by Viktor Orban, who's very anti or paranoid of the West. Okay. We have states like Turkey, who are engaged in gross acts against humanity, crimes against humanity, war crimes in places like Syria, who engaged in large-scale ethnic cleansing, who has actually bought weapons, especially S-400 defense system, from Russia, and is using Russian equipment that undermine NATO's infrastructure, and is going closely more and more towards Russia. We have countries like Turkey doing that, which undermine NATO's values and the lines. I actually agree with Emmanuel Macron, who said back in 2018 that NATO is brain dead because it lacks vision and direction. And that's the most important thing, because an alliance only is as good as its principles and as good as its members maintain those principles. And unfortunately, NATO really hasn't been up to par for that for quite some time. So I worry with the Germans being a bit more disinterested and the Americans not kind of like being nonchalant about the issue with regards to Ukraine. I fear that there won't be any action done to stop Russia from invading the East. Something that I think opens us up to a dangerous precedent being set, which may empower other autocratic countries to act against our best interests, especially those who believe in peace and stability. Yeah. Let's see if I've got any videos to show on that. No. Okay. I think I've covered most of it. Now, do I think Russia's going to invade? I do think so. I think Russia has shown all the sort of like the manpower to want to invade. I mean, I'll show you a couple clips actually. So here's a convoy from the Rostov region in the east of just bordering Ukraine. So let's go. So you can see the military vehicles as well as the APCs. They are moving their way to the border region near Ukraine and by Crimea. Here's a picture. Here are also flight patterns as well by US Global Hawk drone leaving Ukraine after a day-long mission to Lviv. So there's some. Okay, hold on a second. I'm just trying to. Okay, here's another one. This is from Brabuska. Brabuska is in Belarus. So yeah. This is my video. Here are some vehicles also moving through this. Here are some battle tanks near also the border, just to show you guys a bit of it. So here's you can see trains taking vehicles, including some tanks as well, I believe. There's some, yep. Remember, there's over 100,000 troops that are massed along the Ukrainian border. 100,000 Russian troops. Keep that in mind. This massive buildup of troops is dangerous, I would say. These are continued ceasefire violations in the Donetsk region. So at the moment, these are all the troop positions, these red dots along the Ukrainian border. They are from Russia. They estimate the attack some point in the next couple days. Whether it comes to fruition, I don't know. There's also been suggestions that the attack may be postponed until after after the Olympics in China. That could also be a potential avenue. We don't know. But speculations are that Russia will annex the east up to the Dnieper River, which is the river that runs along the middle of Ukraine, which means that Zelensky will have to probably reposition Ukraine's capital in Lviv for the moment. I'm hoping, arguably, I really do hope that the Americans and the West actually do any action to actually prevent this conflict from emerging, but I'm kind of like lacking that, to be honest. I do think that that we need to actually draw a red line, actually maintain the red line here, for our sake, I think. Okay. And finally, sorry guys if I look a bit tired. Remember, I did actually have to film this twice before, so. I remember last time I tried to do this, there was not recording. So there you go. Okay. Iran. So, what can be said about Iran? This will be the final thing I'm covering, and then I'll sort of leave it after 2-hour mark. So here we go. 1 second. Just got to get to it. Okay, cool. Great. So, for those who are unaware, Iran has been ruled by a theocratic regime since 1979, notably the Ayatollah or Mullah regime, with its Vilayat al-Faqih ideology that currently rules Iran. Iran used to be governed by the Shah and a kind of a what we could say an authoritarian-led government. It was overthrown in 1979 due to a revolution that was led or spearheaded by the mullahs. The mullahs then imposed their own system called Vilayat al-Faqih to create a kind of a theocratic mixture of a republic, which is what exists today. Part of this, and I'm saying the groundwork over here, part of this regime made it different, I guess, to the Shah's regime is its ideological prowess, its determination to impose its ideology abroad. This led it to establish a couple things. The first was the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, which was established by the Ayatollah as a mechanism to prevent coups, but also as the most devout followers of the revolution. Some of the main organs of the IRGC include the Al-Quds Force, but as well as the Basij. The Al-Quds Force, which was for the longest time one of the main branches of the IRGC, has been helping to fund multiple different paramilitary groups abroad, most notably Hezbollah in 1984, which used to be one of the largest terrorist organizations until Al-Qaeda, which operates in Lebanon as well as Venezuela and, of course, Central America. But also to help paramilitaries in places like Syria with the NDF, which is the National Defense Forces, as well as Hezbollah units as well, and Shia-aligned paramilitaries. To also facilitate support to the Houthis in Yemen against Saudi Arabia, and to facilitate support to the Hashd al-Shabi, which is kind of like a collection of Shia-aligned paramilitaries in Iraq. The purpose of which has been to undermine the sovereignty of these countries, but also to expand the ideology of Vilayat al-Faqih, as well as Iran's sphere of influence, both against Saudi Arabia, but also against the United States and Israel. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps also supply weaponry to the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ, as well as Hamas in Palestine. Gaza. In 2015, there was an agreement signed between the United States, the United Kingdom, as well as the P5+1, countries. And these countries essentially include Germany, France, the UK, the United States, I think also China, as well as a couple others as well. And this agreement, called the Joint Comprehensive Partnership Agreement, or JCPOA, was made to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Prior to this, there had been sanctions imposed by the Bush administration, Bush Jr. administration, against the Iranian government in order to try and stop it from acquiring a nuclear weapon because of its fanaticism. However, these sanctions were lifted in exchange for Iran essentially adhering to sorry, I'm a bit tired, guys. What we would consider the agreement. A part of the JCPOA included that Iran not actually enrich past 3%, and that Iran not pursue a nuclear weapon. However, part of this JCPOA were things like sunset clauses, which meant that in 10 or 15 years, the sanctions the regulations would be lifted. Okay, this was signed between all these nations in 2015, and sanctions were lifted. However, Iran violated not only United Nations Security Council embargo on it buying weapons from countries like Russia, which it did, which it bought the S-300 system, but also from enriching past 3%, which it did. It also deceived weapon inspectors such as the IAEA, with deceiving weapon inspectors who were refused entry into military sites where presumably ICBM technology was being worked on. So a bunch of violations. The Trump administration in 2017 actually pulled out of the deal due to these violations and due to other concerns as well, which actually essentially broke essentially the JCPOA, which Iran also later withdrew from. This resulted in Iran enriching levels higher than it was doing prior, even though it was technically kind of enriching them anyway, which prompted it essentially to increase its activities abroad and increase its ICBM technology activities. Since the Biden administration has come into power, it's tried to renegotiate Iran back into the JCPOA through the Vienna talks, which is basically the main European vehicle for talks over the JCPOA. However, the United States wants to renegotiate the deal with additions added by, or suggestions I should say, made by Iran, Israel and Bahrain and the UAE, as well as Saudi Arabia, which would address the problems of the former JCPOA. Iran has refused and rather taken a hardline approach. This is evident also with Ebrahim Raisi being the new president of the country, who's already a hardline fanatic. And also the United States has reimposed sanctions on Iran. Now, the last couple of months, Biden has been desperately trying to push Iran to go back to the negotiating table and actually acquiesce and adhere to concessions to the JCPOA renegotiations. Iran has refused. So in this period of time, countries like Israel have taken matters into their own hands and actually engaged in covert operations against Iran. Which it's been doing since 2017, basically. And that's it. That's in a nutshell. Do I think that Iran will return to the deal? No, I don't. Do I think the United States will return to the deal? No, I don't. Which means I believe that there's going to be probably a containment regime that will be put forward by the United States. Sorry guys, I'm a bit tired. Thank you for watching.